It's really the point of Longfellow's poem, "In the hour of darkness and peril and need." Any turning point in American history, we need ordinary people to stand up and make a statement. And Paul Revere is a symbol of that. And that's why even today you have to look at, in every turning point in American history, when there's a struggle, ordinary people rise to the occasion. And Paul Revere is really the epitome of that.
Good evening. Welcome to the final event in this year's Paul Revere Memorial Association Lowell Lecture Series. I'm Tegan Kehoe, the Research and Adult Program Director at the Paul Revere House. And thanks to funding from the Lowell Institute, we offer a series of talks each fall. So if you're just tuning in at our last lecture, I invite you to explore recordings of past talks, which you can find through our media partner, GBH. For many people, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution is an opportunity to reflect on what's working, what's not, and how we tell our national stories. This lecture series has looked at how we tell the story of the Midnight Ride from various perspectives. Revere himself has been mythologized, myth-busted, and mythologized again many times in American history. So it's fitting that we close this series with a conversation with two of our favorite Revere biographers. Jayne E is an independent scholar and the author of A True Republican, The Life of Paul Revere, published by UMass Amherst Press in 1998. Rob Martello is a professor of the history of science and technology at Olin College and the author of Midnight Ride, Industrial Dawn, Paul Revere and the Growth of American Enterprise, which came out in 2010 and is part of the Johns Hopkins series on the history of technology. Moderating the discussion is our own Nina Zannieri, the executive director of the Paul Revere House. And now I will turn it over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Tegan. I like to think of tonight as a chat with two of my friends. I've known Rob and Jayne for more than a couple days. I think of them as the kind of folks you might want to have a beer with, but also they are great scholars. Jayne's book is really what I would call a true biography. Rob's, I would say, contains biographical information, but is more of a deep dive into a particular topic. Both, however, have devoted a good deal of time to research, writing, and thinking about Revere's life and legacy, his accomplishments, his shortcomings, even whether or not there's still more to be learned about Paul Revere, which I think is a question that people sometimes ask. I think we can all agree that Paul is a wonderfully complex and deeply compelling historical figure. He's well known, but not known well at all. Constrained in life by his social status, his legacy is constrained by his Henry Wadsworth Longfellow-driven outsized fame. As we come to the end of this year where we've been celebrating and commemorating the 250th anniversary of Revere's iconic ride, our programming and this particular series has explored the ride, other key players, and to some extent the man. Last week we had a wonderful panel that asked who cares about the Midnight Ride. By extension, that begs the question, who cares about Paul Revere? Or maybe, why care about Paul Revere? Tonight, we hope to answer that question by taking a fresh look at Revere the man. So I'm going to pepper Jayne and Rob with some questions. And in some cases, just for fun, I'll probably chime in with my own answer, which will, of course, be the correct one. For now, just to provide some perspective, why did you choose Revere as subjects? I will say that Revere chose me. I hadn't really thought about Revere until I was hired as the director of the Paul Revere House, and then suddenly I had to care about Paul Revere. But Jayne, can you tell us why you chose Paul Revere as a subject?
I got interested when I worked at the Revere House as a summer job between my junior and senior year at Simmons College. Then I went back there full-time 78 to 81. My education's all split up. I didn't go back to grad school for my doctorate until 1986, and I didn't really plan to write about Paul Revere. I thought, I don't want to get tagged if she can just do research on Paul Revere. But Gordon Wood, my advisor at Brown, said, you worked at the Paul Revere House, didn't you? And I said, yeah. He said, well, you must know a fair amount about Paul Revere. Why don't you work on a biography of Revere? There hasn't been one since the Forbes biography. So thank you, Gordon Wood. That's why I ended up doing my dissertation, which became a book, at his suggestion. But I found him a very interesting character on a number of levels because he's not a founding father, he's not an orator or a statesman. He represents a very important segment of revolutionary society, the people of middling rank. As he said, I'm a man of middling rank, though well off for a tradesman. So we get a kind of a window, and his story is not just his story. It's the story of Adam Colson, the leather dresser, and Gibbon Sharp, the shipwright, but nobody knows who these people are, right? But if I say Paul Revere, there's name recognition, and it tells a larger story of a segment of society who were very involved in the revolution.
Rob, how about you, your story?
Yeah, it's
Why
in some
Paul?
ways similar, especially where you were taking that, Jane, because
Yeah.
I'm a historian of science and technology. And so I really am interested in technologies and the ways that technology shape human beings, shape lives, shape societal directions, but also the way that technology is shaped, right, by the thoughts, the actions, the politics of people. And kind of one of the unspoken goal that I had was, I don't want this to be boring, right? You know, I don't want to spend my career looking at some small tweak to like shoemaking technology that only a certain number of experts in the world will ever care about. So I was looking for that name recognition you were mentioning, a thing that would open the door, but still have the robustness, right, of something rich and human, but actually that matters in the technological sense. So when I was in my graduate program, I was here in Boston, so I was able to say, oh, I'm near the Paul Revere House, and I've heard about Paul Revere, the silversmith. Hopefully there's enough for me to squeeze one paper out of this, right? I think there might be a paper's worth of topic here, right, that I could work on for a few months and tell that story, and people will care about it, and then maybe I'll move on. And then the door kept opening, right? And then as you start learning, you say, wait, it's not just Revere the silversmith. He's working with iron and with bronze and with copper, you know, with all these different products, and politics come in, and economics, even environmental issues. So the more you start to follow this, you know, it's almost like you're following a thread, and it keeps leading to others, right? And the door is expanding, and one paper became a dissertation, became a book. My students still call me the Paul Revere guy, right? You know, so it kind of stays with you. So it's kind of the gift that kept on giving, just because of the richness of this person, not just his life, but the implications he had for the way we manufacture, the way we employ others, right? The way we connect artisan trades and sort of like the act of making to politics and to patriotism. So many dimensions like that. It just kept on unfolding for me.
So as you've worked on Revere and continue to think about him, what is the one thing about him that you still find surprising? What really either surprised you as you were looking at him, or you say, boy, that still, it either doesn't fit or it's novel?
That's me first, perhaps, this time, right? So when I was doing my research, I thought of him, the word, we've had this conversation, Nina, many times, right? Versatile, right? You know, his versatility was very impressive. As a silversmith, even just starting there, he worked on so many different objects. So I would have said, wow, this seems like a person who doesn't know how to say no when a customer comes in and says, Mr. Revere, can you, he'd probably cut you off right there and say yes. And then he'd say, oh, wait, now what is it that you want? Right, you know, and this goes, now, still surprising me, the nature of his versatility is much larger than I thought. It goes far, far beyond a person who just can manufacture lots of things, who's good at learning, good at making connections. This is someone who throughout his long career and long life, which allowed him to have a long career, was versatile in terms of all the different actions that he engaged in and the energy he put into those, well past not just what was retirement age back then, what we would think of as retirement age. He was in his 70s, still pioneering new technical endeavors, but however, he's doing everything related to somebody who's trying to run not just one business, but many businesses. He's doing marketing. He's managing people, not just in an artisan apprentice way, but as beginnings of wage labor, like working on contracts. He's politically active, right? He really, I said it before, he sees himself as a patriot, not just through his midnight ride, right, but through his life of work, right, and saying, how can this help my country? He's thinking about raw materials, about business connections, expanding his business, right, about employing his family in different ways. So I'm sort of getting into a different type of energy and versatility, connection building that he never stopped doing. Like I was ready at some point for him to say to his sons, okay, why don't you take this further now? You know, like I'll stick with what I'm good at, right? You know, not so. His sons often were running the thing that he just figured out so he could jump to the next one. So that never ceases to amaze me.
Jane, how about you?
The role that Freemasonry played in his life. And when I worked at the Revere House, I knew he was a Mason, but when I started doing all of the research, it allowed him an arena for leadership that he did not have in the larger society. Americans don't like to discuss the class system. Too bad, I'm going to discuss it. Paul Revere is a man of middling rank. He would never hold high political office. He's not an orator in Faneuil Hall. He doesn't write brilliant essays. His political thought you will see expressed in actions. But in the confines of his Masonic lodge, St. Andrew's Lodge and the Massachusetts Grand Lodge, he was respected for his leadership. He becomes a Mason in September 1760. In January, he's a Master Mason. He becomes a Royal Archmason, which requires more study. He holds his first office within a year. By 1771, he's Master of the Lodge. It makes him elevated, in not just in Masonic circles. In order to be a Mason, you have to be nominated by a member. Every member of the lodge has to vote you in. So it's a signal to people outside the walls of St. Andrew's Lodge. This is a man worthy of respect, a man of honor, virtue, and integrity. It also gives him lifelong customers. Without Masons, I mean, Paul Revere's Masonic brothers fund not just the silver shop, they go to his other businesses. Yeah. It introduces him to people like Dr. Joseph Warren, and the role he would play within the lodge vis-a-vis with Dr. Warren, he always serves under him. It's the same role he plays in the Patriot organizations. It gives him status, and although he's not known as an orator or statesman, his Masonic addresses are really quite eloquent. Everything's digitized now. You can go on Masonic genealogy, and it elevates him in the world. And he feels he's part of a large worldwide movement in Masonic circles, but also in the revolutionary movement. There's a connection between the ideologies of both movements.
Now, you've set me up, the two of you, because what surprises me about Revere is what a mediocre soldier he is. And
You're being kind.
you've just laid out all of these leadership qualities, innovation, networking, but when it comes to the military, he never makes that work. Although later in life, he will call himself Colonel Revere. So he liked that. He liked that sort of connection. But in terms of being up to the challenge of military, and I sort of thought he was a military hero, you know, when I first started thinking about Revere, and he's really not. That's probably the last thing he is. Yes. But I'm just curious as to how you feel about that piece of him, why that doesn't work.
The military part in particular, like what's going on there.
I just threw a question in that I didn't give you in advance. I know that's cheating.
I love the curveball. Yeah, that keep me on my toes. I need that in life. Yeah, it might connect to something that I was going to talk about. Like we're thinking about where he operates well, right? You know, and where he maybe doesn't operate as well. And one thing that I was going to say, so I'm cheating a little bit. I'm going to connect this to a question that you did ask, right? Because my answer to the two are connected. Because I love Paul Revere. He's given me I owe him my career. So like I'm really respecting a lot of the things he did. But when I noticed a lot of his strengths and weaknesses, I did notice he's very confident, right? You know, and that's a strength that leads to the weakness of sometimes he doesn't quite gauge how he's perceived by others, right? You know, and so there's something about that where sometimes, you know, he's saying like, oh, I figured this out. Oh, there's a good answer to that. Let me solve the problem. In the shop, that's working pretty well, right? You know, he's able to confidently suggest a line of direct. I think we could make it this way. I think we can rearrange our processes that way. And then if he's right, it's perfect. If he's wrong, it was a good start, right? We could then adjust. When he's working with other people, maybe overconfidence isn't the right thing. And I feel like I've seen sometimes him get impatient, right? You know, when he's corresponding with others who he feels aren't quite up to snuff. And so this is where, so when I think about, right, some of the military things, he's sort of like, oh, I've solved that problem. I think I've got an answer. And in the military, it doesn't quite work that way. You know, you have to sometimes work up to your superiors and do things their way, even if you think there's a better way, and, you know, trying to explain yourself or just, you know, try things in a different way, but sort of suspend your disbelief and do something. And I don't think he was political in that way. So that's my thought. I'm going to turn to my colleague here for help to bail me out of this question.
Revere's very ambitious, which is his great strength, but his great weakness.
Yeah.
It leads to a lot of disappointments. He desperately wanted a Continental Army commission as a colonel and the Continental Artillery. He didn't get it. Some of it is kind of common sense. He really had no military experience. He served as an artillery lieutenant in the 7 Years' War, but he did not see any action.
Right.
But there's a series of letters exchanged between John Adams and Henry Knox, and they're discussing candidates for this position. They're not discussing people by name, but by qualities. Knox uses, it's a very common 18th century expression. He said, an officer should be a man of reading and reflection. Now, Revere was a reader. He belonged to the Boston Library Society after the Revolution, and he's kind of self-educated. But I don't see Revere sitting in a book-lined study saying, let me reflect. He's a man of action. So he's bitterly disappointed. He wrote to John Lamb, the New York Son of Liberty, who did get a Continental Army commission. He said, I have never been taken notice of by those whom I call my friends. When he means friends, he doesn't mean buddies. He means people above him, patrons. It's really directed at John and Samuel Adams. He didn't get the commission. I shall have to be content in the state's service. And part of it is his ambition leads to, he's kind of hot-headed and abrasive. And in the military, I mean, I don't know if we're going to get into Penobscot, but he was court-martialed and eventually vindicated. But he disobeyed an order. When I used to do tours for the Park Service, the North End tour ended up in the Paul Revere Mall by the statue. And I'd say to the people, now when an officer gives you an order, what is the one and only one correct answer? And everybody would say, yes, sir. Revere is not a yes, sir kind of guy. Yeah. So that leads to disappointments.
You know, it's interesting too, and I know David knows about this. There is a portrait of Revere that is essentially the Copley head, and he's in a military uniform. And it was done by a family member. And so the family also wanted him to be a war hero of some kind. So it's kind of interesting that in the after the fact, that notion of being in the military and some kind of a military hero comes up above the notion of being a working man silversmith, even though that is the one thing Revere's really not good at.
It's a very history-minded generation. They do things for the ages, reputation. When we say Revere's ambitious, that can have a negative connotation. The first time I said this was in a lecture at Old South Meeting House in 1995, I think. And I got like, I picked up like a bad vibe from the audience. I used to be a musician, so I like to watch audiences and you pick up body language and stuff like that. And I said, if you look up ambition in the Oxford English Dictionary, it has the negative connotation, like I don't care who I have to step on and who I have to claw. But it also is a desire to gain fame and honor and a reputation for posterity. So it has a positive connotation as well. So I think he's ambitious in both ways, the good and the bad definition.
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about weaknesses or failings, which there's probably more than what we've done, so I may go back to that. But let's talk a little bit about what drove Revere, because I think the weaknesses, the things he's good at, the things he's bad at, there's something that drives him. I think some of it has to do with the fact that he's constantly coming up against the glass ceiling of the day, which is he's not a Harvard guy. So he's gets to a certain point. When he is useful, he is allowed into the center of the action. When he's not the right sort, he's sort of told to be on the other side of the door. So I think in his life, he's constantly going back and forth, and whether it's ambition, as you say, or he's trying to prove himself. So can you both talk a little bit about what you think drove him?
Me first? I'd be happy to. It's such a fun question. This is actually one of the things that kept me going with the research so deeply. The more I tried to answer this question, the more answers I thought I discovered. So I almost have three answers, right? The first two things that drove him, I believe, were conflicting drives, right? So on the one hand, you kind of said it really nicely. He really saw himself, right, as someone who should be rising in society. You think that he believes in merit, right, and saying, look, I'm a smart person, I'm competent, I do nothing but demonstrate this competence in many different ways. I'm a member of different organizations, my business is doing well, and I'm going into other businesses, and I'm answering for different parts of his career, right? As his career unfolds, he has more career evidence to this, saying, I feel like I deserve to be one of the people making decisions. I'm tired of being told that I'm going to just be helping others, right, implement decisions. I believe I should be up there, right, in the seat of power. From my angle as a historian of technology, he has a fascinating second drive. He loves technologies. He loves rolling up his sleeves and figuring out how things work. You just could tell in some of his correspondence, he can't resist, right? He's just sitting there tinkering and experimenting and just trying different things, whether it's different alloys of bronze, trying to combine different amounts of metal, or different ways of using his workers, or different ways of using equipment. He just keeps trying to dig in there and figure out the process. He loves science in this degree that it was extant right at this time. And these two things did not play well together, right? Benjamin Franklin was actually better, right, at one point in his career saying, okay, I don't have ink on my fingers anymore. It's time. I have retired from that now. I am a man of science and philosophy. Ben Franklin knew how to play the game. Revere kept going back in. So instead of ink on his fingers, it might be metal shavings under his fingernails. And he's like, I got to get back into the shop. I think there's a new way to do this. So those two drives are wonderful, right? When you see, he wants to be the leader, but he was living in an age where the person swinging the hammer wasn't seen as a leader, right? But he couldn't stop doing that. And I'll just more quickly, I'm not going to go into as much detail on the thing that to me ties it all in a bow, is in a way that we may not talk about as much today, he's actually a patriot. I think that's the third part of what drives him. Both of these first two things, he really is always thinking, what's good for my country, right? I care about this movement. We had a big resistance movement. I was a part of it. I'm delighted that we succeeded. Where are we going next as a country? So he's able to kind of fall back to that position time and time again, right? And say, okay, look, I may be only like the quote, I'm well off for a tradesman, right? It's this qualified, he's not saying, oh, I'm proud of my work. I guess I'm well off for a tradesman, but then it's like, okay, well, what do we need? Navy Department, are there some goods here that I can help with, right? Are we looking towards a war? So he's always like tying it up with that patriotic angle. So this interplay is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
I was reading, he bragged about his work a lot, and his copper is so good, you could pound it X number of times and it won't crack.
Yes,
and I'm writing
yes,
the margins of my notes, buy American, buy American. He wants to make money and be successful, but in a way that also serves the public good. I mean, he's serious about it.
For sure.
I thought it was funny. When I first started doing research, I was looking at the index of Revere's papers. And it says, recipe books. And I think, Paul cooked? I didn't know that. And you mentioned how he taught himself chemistry.
Yes.
He read Watson's chemistry. Revere went to a writing school. He learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. He taught himself chemistry, and he experimented. I'm thinking, recipe books? I never knew that aspect. I didn't know that Paul liked to cook. He writes down his experiments and what works and what doesn't.
That's right.
And
recipe for gunpowder or for the kind of clay or mud that you use for a mold. That's right.
But I always tell people, when you go to the Museum of Fine Arts, get up close to the Copley portrait, not so close that the guard yells at you and says, step back. Because you don't always pick it up in the reproduction. His fingernails are jagged and dirty. Okay? He may call himself Paul Revere Esquire, but even when he has the copper mill and he has people, he still works with his hands, with the guys. So that means he's only going to rise. He always like bumps his head about the glass ceiling. And that's a source of frustration. He becomes successful financially, and he contributes to the public good, but he still works. I mean, he had the Gilbert Stuart portrait, and he can wear lace and ruffles all he wants, and he can call himself Paul Revere Esquire, but he still has broken, dirty fingernails.
He wants to be in there.
So I always go and visit the portrait and look at his fingernails.
I love what you both said, and what it brings me to is something that I've thought about recently. It sort of struck me, is that for all of his struggles in life, he's driving, he's doing all these things. At the end of his life, he says, I'm content. And I always think about that, and I think how wonderful that is for this man who struggles and does all of these things and has these weaknesses and these failings and shortcomings and these successes. But when he's looking back, he says, I'm content. And I think, boy, that's something we all would like to have happen when we look back to say, for all that. So.
My mom always, when you'd ask her how she was, and I didn't get it when I was a kid, she would say, I'm content, not I'm happy. And I didn't understand it. And I realized contentment is acceptance. There's good and there's bad in the life, but you get to a point where you have that equilibrium. I accept what happened in my life. Yeah. And his poem Cannondale, which is all about that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It
So-
goes on and on for like 11 pages.
That's
I'm reading, I'm going, is this going to end? Is this going to? I'm not getting any younger. I hope he ends it soon.
So with Revere, and certainly I think as we've looked at the 250th, there have been a lot of thought about, are some of these characters that we keep bringing up and studying, are they still relevant? Do they still matter? So why do you think Revere is still important to look at today? Where does his relevance come from?
Do you want to go first?
The whole idea of, it's really the point of Longfellow's poem, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, any turning point in American history, we need ordinary people to stand up and make a statement. And Paul Revere is a symbol of that. And that's why even today you have to look at, in every turning point in American history, when there's a struggle, ordinary people rise to the occasion. And Paul Revere is really the epitome of that. He also, like I said, I used to mention names of all the other artisans who were members of his Masonic lodge on my tour. And I said, you're all looking at each other saying, who's she talking about? I said, if I told you the story of the leather dresser, Adam Colson, he's Paul Revere, except no one knows who he is because he's just a leather dresser. He didn't make the midnight ride. Revere's story tells us about a segment of society, men and women of middling rank, who played a role in the revolution. You don't just have to be an eloquent speaker or write essays. You can sign a non-importation agreement, which is what women did. Paul Revere and William Dawes signed a non-importation agreement. When Dawes got married, he and his bride, Mehitable, appeared in homespun clothing. They got their names in the newspaper about this. So Revere's story tells that an ordinary person can rise up, and for all the mistakes in the Longfellow poem, and I worked at Longfellow National Historic Site, so I feel like I should always apologize for Longfellow. And by the way, he did write to a friend, George Washington Green, a Dawes descendant, Henry Ware Holland, wrote a book on his famous ancestor, and Longfellow writes to his friend George Washington Green in 1878. He convicts me of high crimes and misdemeanors. And Longfellow continues, let's just call it poetic license. For all of the things that he changed in the poem, he got a lot right about Paul Revere. The boldness, the commitment to an idea, the bravery. I mean, he's in the middle of the night, and British soldiers are patrolling the roads. He could have been shot. He was almost captured right at the beginning of the ride. So this guy is bold, and he's brave. And he's a man of action and believes in ideas about liberty and things that we sort of, the words that we use, liberty, equality, all the freedom, stuff like that. Revere believes in this stuff and is willing to put his life on the line. So Longfellow got a lot right about the essence of Paul Revere, the actual details of the ride. He's not writing to the revolutionary. He's writing to people on the eve of the Civil War, creating a romantic image of the revolution. And Paul Revere becomes the symbol, a time when Americans, North and South, believed in the same ideas. I mean, he glosses over and he makes the revolutionary, like, all for one and one for all. But it's an important point. And that's why Revere, I think today, people say someone can stand up for their ideas. And they may be an ordinary person. Maybe they didn't go to Harvard, and maybe they're not a gentleman, and maybe they don't have fancy clothes. But they're committed to an idea. They're worthy of respect and study.
Again, this is one of those questions I love thinking about, right? And I could answer it with different hats on, so I'll be quick about the different two hats. I'll leave myself to two hats. That's one too many, perhaps, right? But with my history of technology hat on, I just think, like, what do we have to learn about Paul Revere today? What's really interesting, Paul Revere had this magnificently successful career, right, as a manufacturer. At no point in his career did he invent something new that was a new product, right? He worked with a lot of silver work. He then made cast iron type of common goods like window weights and tools for fireplace or stove pieces. He worked as a bell caster. In fact, I think I hear a bell right now sounding behind me, right? So thank you.
I thought it was my hearing aid.
That was it. No, I think that's all been timed beautifully with this response, right? And then cannon casting, then copper bolts and spikes, and his big, I call it the holy grail of his career, he was the first American to roll copper into sheets to protect the outside of naval vessels. But they had been done before. England had been doing this for some time. At no point did he invent a new product. And so a lot of times in history, we just say, okay, well, who invented each one of those things? Let's tell that story. And a lot of the history that we should be celebrating are these ideas of technology transfer. Someone saying, look, I'm going to bring that to America. I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to use what I've learned as a silversmith to deal with bronze work in a different way. I'm going to apply that knowledge to a different field. So he's making these connections. He's helping his country catch up with the another country, even though it doesn't surpass that other country, which is England in this case, the high-tech power of its day. But he closes the gap considerably through his own career, right, by the end of it. And those stories are worth celebrating too. So I think this is very relevant. We're talking about startup companies right now, and we often focus on like the new idea that's never been done before. But sometimes it's an existing idea that you're looking at differently is the thing we should be really focusing on or encouraging. So that's my first answer. The quicker answer maybe that I'll give, and this one I could say pretty quickly, it builds on what Jayne's excellent answer, right, is I mentioned before, I see Paul Revere, when I look at his writing and I think about what he's done, including the contentment at the end of his life, a lot of that has to do with his patriotism, right, his idea that this is the revolutionary, right, who gave what he had, right, and gave all that he could to the revolutionary movement, saw it succeed, saw his country go through some challenging times, and was doing his best to try and move things in the right direction. Nowadays, just what can we learn today? If someone walked in and said, I'm a patriot, most of us would not take that in a positive way. We'd say, okay, what are you selling, right? You know, what's your angle? This, regardless of party, regardless of what's going on, we'd say, okay, what are you about to justify, right? You know, what of your own endeavors are you about to try and promote using patriotism as a brush, right? And all that, and that's a shame to me, right? That's a shame. We've sort of gotten a little more cynical, right? A little bit less earnest, right? For someone like Revere saying, look, I'm actually doing this for my country, also for himself. I think that's what you were saying before. I said, yes, I think I should be enriched by this hard work I'm doing. He didn't hesitate. So he was not saying I'm going to give away all my income or anything like that. No, no, no. He wants to thrive, but he also is doing it because he sees it as moving his country forward. He's just sort of earnestly making that claim. It's really a touching point, right? That it's, to me, sometimes it's a shame, right? That seems so dated and naive almost. Like, okay, really, a patriot? Come on, what are you pushing here? What's your angle here? What are you trying to do? And I think there's something we could learn from this person, right? From this example. So I just wanted to end on that. So that's my sneaky second answer to your question, Nina. Had to get
Well,
two
because
in
he briefly was a merchant and he's selling like useless goods, luxury goods. When he transitions with the bells and the can, he's making things that are useful for his
Yes.
society and also making money.
That's correct. And employing people,
And-
right? Employing
right.
others, building up some local knowledge, right? Some of his workers would go on and start their own company. So he was very excited about that. Absolutely
Yeah.
right.
So now I'm convinced that this Revere guy is pretty good. So my question is, does he merit further study? And I want to, and the reason I ask that is that people often will say, oh, you know, all the Revere silver's been found, I'm sure, or all the documents have been found. And the answer to that is no, they haven't. Revere silver pops up from time to time and surprises us, and documents pop up from time to time. And in fact, I want to share a document that recently came to our attention. We actually had it on display for a little while. We don't own it, but it's a wonderful letter. It's a business letter, and Revere loved to add little personal notes at the end of his business letters. Why waste the paper? You can always have a note to your kids. And so this is from an 1810 letter from Paul to his son, Joseph Warren Revere, and it's all full of business and ships coming and going and copper and all kinds of things. But at the end, he says, our families in general are well. I'm the only invalid. The disorder that was in my face and hands has got into my legs, which makes it very difficult to walk. But my health is good. In short, I find myself an old man. And so we find these letters, or these letters pop up, and suddenly we have this little window into Paul as an aging gentleman. And I love the fact that he complains about his hands and his legs and his feet and then says, I'm in good health. So his perception of that was that this is just what happens when you get older. So I certainly think he merits further study, if only because there are things out there that are going to sort of come to light. And for me, and I know, Rob, you and I have talked about this, I would love someone to look at his workforce and the sort of transition from the workforce in a silver shop, which is a smaller operation, to him being able to figure out how to run a mill operation. And I go back to the military thing. If this was a guy who could figure that out, but he couldn't figure out how to work around ordering men around in a military setting. But for me, that would be an area that would be rich. So for each of you, is there an area that you think should be looked at more closely, other than the one I just gave you?
Other than that awesome one. Oh, do you want to go first, please?
I tried to find a little bit more about his thoughts about slavery.
Interesting.
There's no evidence he ever owned an enslaved person. There's nothing in his books. And there's no statement by, one of the problems is most of his papers are business papers. The handful of letters we've talked about is political ideology, but there's no place where he says, I am opposed to slavery. There's a letter from a man named Thomas Wadsworth to Revere. From what I can piece together, Wadsworth was originally from Boston and was living in South Carolina. He's writing a letter to his old friend Paul Revere describing his situation in life. And he writes to Paul, I have X number of acres of land and I own 9 slaves. And he writes, I know what you'd say. Would you like to be a slave? And all I can say is, that's what they do here, and ask me no more about it. I do not have Revere's letter, but obviously from what Wadsworth says, Revere is opposed to slavery. So every once in a while I'll go back and see if I can get at that in another way. For somebody of his time and place, he's very open-minded about things. I think he probably didn't approve of slavery. His youngest daughter, Mariah, had a very good education, so he felt that women should be educated. And in a lot of areas, he doesn't seem to have the anti-Catholic bias that's very common in this time period. He's friends with Moses Michael Hayes, a fellow member of the Masonic Lodge, who's Jewish. So those kind of things, but there's not enough from his papers. I wish I could find more. I tend to look at miscellaneous collections. I like to get, my best stuff comes from miscellaneous collections, where there's not enough to make up a collection of one person or family. So every once in a while I go to the miscellaneous collections and MHS, Mass Historical, and I do it chronologically. I pick a time period I think might be, and just kind of flip through, and every once in a while something pops up. You have to be careful when you do research, because sometimes people, just the way today they create an image on social media, that people do craft an image. So when you look at the accounts of things, you got to go, maybe there's another way of looking at this. But I would like to find more about his thoughts on slavery.
It's such a fun, before I answer, I just want to say, I love that you brought up the Wadsworth letter in this letter. It's such an excellent answer. And the Wadsworth letter, I remember when I was in grad school reading that letter, I was cracking up. First, I had to figure out, was I reading it correctly? And then I was saying, because Wadsworth, in effect, right, he writes to Revere. So it's all in a letter, right? It sounds like it's almost a phone conversation. No, it's a letter that Wadsworth is writing, saying, hey, here's my status here. And I can imagine you asking me this. Here's my answer, and don't ask me that again. And it's like,
you know,
Revere didn't say anything. This is you, right? You're inventing the whole conversation and getting mad at it, right?
I found Wadsworth's will in South Carolina, and he freed his enslaved people. And I'm thinking, wouldn't I love to say, Paul Revere convinced him to do it? I would love to find the letter where Revere says, free your enslaved people.
He's like, I'm tired of Revere yelling at me. And it's like, you know, you wrote the letter. Revere didn't say anything. That's, I know, it's a shame we don't have the response or what prompted that.
I got some stuff from the repository of the letter, and they sent me the guy's will and everything. And I thought, oh my God, I wonder if Revere influenced him.
That's right. And Nina, I loved your answer about the workers. I think that's such an important angle. I love to look at Revere's business sort of from the angle of other businesses a little bit too, right? So what is his role in the network of what else is going on in Boston? I think there's a lot of interesting things there. Who's he buying his supplies from, right? Where are his products going? You mentioned the workers, right? How he's managing it. This is a semi-cheat because I'm borrowing some of your answer, but those workers, like I mentioned, often move on, right? They go somewhere else. They start up their own shop or something like that. I feel that Revere's impact, right, the ideas that he has, are well beyond what we look at, you know, by just looking at what's happening here in Boston. And a few of the examples, speaking back to the letters again, several people have written to Revere. One was in Baltimore, I forget the gentleman's name, right, where they say, Mr. Revere, I'm also trying to roll copper into sheets. I know you've been doing that successfully, but my sheets are not even. One side is thicker than the other. We have Revere's response, where in some cases he includes a diagram. He'll say, look, I think your two rollers are not aligned properly. If they're not, one side is different. Here's what you got to do, right? So he's giving them a little bit of help. He's sponsoring others. It would be really interesting to learn more, right, about like what's going on here. Is he shrewdly saying, I need allies, right? I need other manufacturers to join me and we can lobby together. Is this back to the patriotism? And he's saying, look, we might be going to war with Great Britain any year now. Right? The more of us manufacturing this stuff, the better our Navy will do. Is it some other motivation or a different set of things? Such an interesting question, right? You know, that I think we could dig into more.
As you can imagine, and folks in the audience who work at the Revere House, you'll identify with this. Visitors say the darndest things, and they ask the darndest questions. And sometimes you think, where could that question possibly have come from? But there it is. I will share my favorite question, and then I'm going to ask you what sort of question someone's asked you where you've said, oh boy, oddest question. For me, and this is true, people don't believe me when I say this, I was in the Revere House. Someone came up to me and said, okay, help me out. When was Paul Revere president? Before or after George Washington? Feel free to call out an answer if you have one. I think I might have turned and walked away. I don't think I knew what to do. So in your sort of travels where people, is there a question that pops into your mind that someone asked you that was just
I got two
amazing?
that were quick ones, right? One was saying to me like, oh, Revere did all these different industries. This is great. But when did he have time to make all that beer? Right. And I said, I think you're thinking of the Sam Adams logo, right? So it's like, yeah, I don't know where we got that one. And the other one, again, is like, I often get lots of questions, not answering the question directly. I get lots of questions when I visit a different group, like a library somewhere, and they're always curious, did Revere make the weather vane on our town hall? Those are good questions, right? Or maybe Revere made the cannon that this group has and all that. It's like really interesting stuff. And so once one group was saying, oh, I'm so interested. Yeah, I knew that he made bells already, right? But why did that one crack? And I was like, what one crack? The one in his church that he made, right? They said, no, the one in Philadelphia. And I said, oh, you mean the Liberty Bell? Yeah, he didn't make that one. Yeah, so that was so that's one that I enjoyed too, right? Kind of like I know that we want him to be involved in every cool patriotic manufacturing thing in our country, but we can't give him that one. I'm really sorry about that.
The reason why I brought this, this is the first publication I ever wrote on Paul Revere. It accompanied an exhibit. Paul Revere's Ride from History to Folklore. And it's still on sale at the Paul Revere House. Sadly, I do not get royalties, but let us move on. It was prompted by the odd question. I worked at the Revere 76 as a student, and then I went back 78, and I think it was like 78. Somebody asked me, I heard Revere was drunk and fell off the horse when he made the ride. I went, what? And it started coming up like every day for like a couple of weeks. And it must be they heard it on a tour or something. So I was trying to like hypothesize, where would a story like that originate? Is there some kernel of truth there? So one of the first stops Revere made on his ride is very critical, not just to warn people in houses, but militia captains. So they in turn would send their teenage son out and round up the rest of the men in the company. So he stops at the home of Captain Isaac Hall, what is now the town of Medford, then Mystic, Minuteman. Medford was famous for the distilling of rum in the 18th century. That was a big, big market in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York. So I was like being kind of funny and sarcastic, and I said, well, maybe he stopped at Captain Hall's home, and Hall offers him a mug of rum, and that gives Revere the courage to finish his ride. And maybe it was drunk and fell off the horse. And everybody laughed, and they left the room, except one guy stayed behind. And he looked left, and he looked right to make sure everyone had left the room and gone upstairs. He reaches his hand over the railing and says, hi, I'm a descendant of Captain Isaac Hall. You never know who's going to be on your tours. He said, my family told that story not to be cynical. That was my family's connection to history. My ancestor gave Paul Revere the mug of rum that gave him the courage to carry out the midnight ride. And we told that out of affection and our love of history. But there's another possible explanation. In 1968, when they reenact the ride, the rider is from the governor's, what do they call it? The governor's?
National Lancers.
Yeah, yeah. And it's in the Boston Globe. Apparently the guy playing Revere fell off the horse. And it's in the Boston Globe. So I think the assumption was, must have had a couple of drinks. He fell right out of the saddle. So you don't know where stories come. The hardest part of working at historic sites is not bursting out laughing or saying, are you an idiot? No, especially when you're after the Park Service, when you're in uniform, you can't say that. So I had like a whole internal monologue going on. But sometimes the stories and the myths are not completely wrong. If you backtrack and you try to figure, is there some element of the story that might be true, and then it got embellished. During the bicentennial, it was a very cynical time of debunking. Paul Revere never married the ride, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is about debunking, what's really fun about debunking is you have to be important for somebody to want to tear you down. So in a way, it's kind of a backhanded compliment, But there was a lot of like negative stuff in the bicentennial. I was so glad it was over. Now I just have to live through Rev 250. We used to joke and say, well, at least we'll be dead for the next one. But there was a lot of negativity. And if people, I try to make people laugh, because if people laugh, like their shoulders, or they relax, it opens up their mind. If they think about it, they realize, of course that couldn't have happened. If you can get people laugh, they go, oh, wait a minute, there's another explanation for this.
All right, here's the big one. We've got a couple big ones left.
Should I
but
get
this
my
is the big
asthma
one.
inhaler out?
If Paul Revere walked in that door right now, what would you want to ask him? I'm going to answer for me, because at the Paul Revere House, Paul says nothing about the house. Nothing. Doesn't say, I liked it, I hated it, the rooms were big, the rooms were small, I had green paint, nothing. So I would want to have a little chat with Paul Revere about what the house was like. Then I might have to cry because we'd have to make changes, so I don't know. That would be one. So if you could ask him one question.
One question. I would have to ask him about the different things that he did throughout his life. What was your favorite, right, product to make, right? Just there's so many ways he might answer that. Like say, I love the metal silver, right? Or I love the cannon because it's helping our military, right? Or I love the process of making this. It's very challenging. I would like to know where he comes in there. Like, and I'm hoping the answer isn't, oh, this one made the most money, right? I don't want that answer, but I'll take that answer if that's the truth. But I'd like to know, like, if you, Mr. You did all these things, which one really speaks to you? Would you keep doing if you could keep doing it more? And then see what else we could learn from digging into that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Jayne?
Because he has such a strong personality, I would ask him, is there anything you would change about any decisions you made in your life? It could be personal, could be political. I'm pretty sure I know what his answer would be.
What would his
no.
answer be?
Heck no.
Heck no?
I'm trying to clean up the language. I might have children in the audience. And I don't think he would have. I think he was very firm in his opinions.
Interesting.
And once he made a decision, I don't think he went back and rethought about it. That's just an opinion.
Well, we do fantasize about having a seance and getting some of those answers. I don't know that that's going to happen. So I'm going to do one more question, and then we'll open it up, because I've had so much fun asking all these questions. I'm sure you have some. Who is your favorite Revere author or biggest influence? And you can't say each other, because no.
That was
Can't do that.
getting
So it's this is sort of, who should we read after we've read your books again?
Again, but a Revere author, we're saying, or something.
Could be a Revere author or another author who influenced your work on Revere. I'm going to open it up a little.
I've got a sneaky answer. You took my first answer, was sitting right next to me, right? So, but I'm going to play by the rules. Right? I'll give you one. And I hinted at it earlier, right? I said this. When I was writing about Paul Revere, I actually learned a lot from studying Ben Franklin too, right? So I want to say there are many good biographies, right, of Benjamin Franklin. So the shelf groans under the weight of them. They have many different answers to that. But the ones that focus on his early life get at some of these interesting issues of what happens when you're born at the bottom, right? And you are an artisan and you are getting ink on your fingers and you're working very hard, but you have dreams, right? That you've got ways of contributing to our society. And Franklin and Revere are both really sharp people. They're both ambitious, right? In all senses of the word, right? And they both actually move up, right? They move up at different heights. Franklin goes all the way up, right? As high as anybody can go, most famous man in the world. So seeing his story and his trajectory really helps you look at Revere's a little differently. So I think it's interesting in and of itself. But if you're interested in Revere and you look at what Franklin did and didn't do, there are some choices Revere didn't make that usually work out really well for Franklin, right? So it gives you a different sense of a way to do it, right? A sense of a way to use things. One quick example is using humor. Right? Revere, you get a sense that he has a certain kind of humor, but it's maybe edgy, right? You have a sense like maybe a sharp humor, and you might exhaust his humor if he thinks you're wasting his time, right? You could imagine the humor going away. Ben Franklin is the master, right? Ben Franklin has a twinkle in his eye, and is able to tell. Some of his enemies at one point said, "Look, Franklin's going to make a motion to speak. Don't let him speak. He's going to tell a story. Everyone's going to be laughing. They're all going to vote for whatever he says, right? Do not recognize him from the chair, right? So you get a sense this is the guy, right, who could weave it together. So I would urge you to go check some of those stories out.
Yeah. For the Midnight Ride, David Fisher's book, that's the book. The Esther Forbes biography is interesting for painting a colorful picture of Boston, but it lacks footnotes, so a lot of times that's a little frustrating. I actually like Elbridge Henry Goss, the 2-volume biography, 1891. It's still, I just saw it today on Amazon, but it's also, you can read it for free on Internet Archive. And then for the Masonic research, there are 2 equally important books, Steve Bullock, Revolutionary Brotherhood, and Edith Stebeckley's Paul Revere and Freemasonry, and the article that he did for the Artisan Businessman exhibit you guys did. I think those are excellent.
I mean, for me, Esther Forbes is interesting because people either love it or don't. You know, when we have staff members read it, and you know, some people they just they can barely make it through, and other people love it. I like the fact that Esther is also breaking a glass ceiling. She's writing at a time when academic historians are not really fond of women who are not academic historians pretending to be academic historians. And she is frustrating. The one thing where you go, oh, please, Esther, let there be a footnote, and there isn't. And then there's lots of footnotes where you don't want them. But, you know, she really, you know, she was a remarkable author, very, very, you know, she won prizes, and she's an interesting character. And I think we're going to do a little bit about Esther just to sort of give her back a spot at the table. But it was always interesting when we were working with David Hackett Fisher, and he would mumble something about Esther Forbes. And I said, well, but David, you just referenced her here, right there. He took Esther Forbes. And I'd say, well, David, you just referenced her over here again. So, you know, she really did set the standard. So those are my questions. I think we'd love to see if folks in the audience have some questions.
Hi. So I'm not trying to self-aggrandize, but I want to introduce myself. I'm the director of another Paul Revere museum, which is opening in Canton in just a month or so. The Paul Revere Museum of Discovery and Innovation, about his role in copper in Canton. And we obviously have a lot of exhibits about Paul Revere and his life and the choices he made and the stuff he made and everything. I don't think we have anything about Masons. I know nothing of this besides, I mean, hearing that he was a Mason, and like you're kind of alluding to connections that being a Mason helped him out quite a bit. And I'm just curious about that. Is there a point, I mean, when you get into after the war, and he's making all these bells, and he's making cannons, and he's working on the USS Constitution, and then he's rolling copper, and then he's cladding the USS Constitution in copper. Is there a point at which he doesn't need the Mason connections anymore? Or
It ends kind of mysteriously. When I was doing research at the Massachusetts Grand Lodge, I'm reading the Grand Lodge proceedings. 2 of his lodges, it's very complicated, and usually only Masons are interested in this, but his first lodge, they break up over that they should continue their allegiance to St. Andrews. St. Andrews gets a charter from the Grand Lodge of Scotland, or they should be an independent lodge. Revere votes to leave the lodge, and he forms another lodge, Rising States Lodge. That lodge, it's unclear what happens. There's comments about dissension going on. And his name disappears from the Grand Lodge proceedings after about 1809. He did not have a Masonic funeral. There's certain suppositions. Masons are not supposed to bring political differences into the lodge. The most important bond is the Masonic bond of brotherly love. You leave everything else outside, but they're human beings. There's a couple things going on. Revere is Grand Master 1794 to 1797. The next 2 Grand Masters are Democratic Republicans, not Federalists. And there's one letter Revere writes to Reverend George Richards in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They're complaining about the declining quality of Masons with the Jeffersonian age. But that's it. There's not a whole lot of that. There's a couple of comments. Now, the boring explanation is he's starting the copper mill in Canton. He's going back and forth between Boston and Canton. He's an older guy. Maybe he just doesn't have the time. And what I've learned as a historian, sometimes there's an exciting possible explanation, but sometimes there's a boring logical explanation. So I can't tie it up in a neat bow. Maybe he's disappointed in the quality of Masons now that they're Jeffersonians. But it could just be he's an older guy. He's starting a new business, and he just doesn't have the time for Freemason. But it was such an important part of his life from 1760. sometimes you can't tie everything up with a nice little bow.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. Just quick question. As history and the average American, I should say, learns about Paul Revere, the one thing they learn about him is the Midnight Ride. How would each of you, if he was not remembered for the Midnight Ride, how would you want history to remember him? And what was the defining actions that textbooks should look at instead of the Midnight Ride if, for some reason, he did not participate?
So imagine there's no Midnight Ride, right?
Let's say he's
just yeah, so just something like that. That's not how I do that. So yeah, we're looking at me for some reason here, right? So yeah, that's it. So,
Take it away.
Yeah,
take it away.
Yeah, I'm leaping right into this answer. Yeah, Paul Revere. I think of him as sort of the person who led America from crafts almost into industry. I call it proto-industry, right? So he sort of got us very close to the Industrial Revolution, well before we date the Industrial Revolution beginning. So he begins as a craftsman. He has apprentices. He has the art and mystery of his trade, right? He's working with all of the bespoke practices that we think of as crafts. And by the end of his career, he is bringing in wage labor, double entry accounting, some standardization of goods. He's going towards standardized ideals, right, for his work, different relationships with raw materials, and I could go on and on. So he is really trying hard to not just catch up with England in terms of the things he makes, but catch up with England in terms of the way we should make them and even surpass England. And he is very much responsible for a lot of these things moving forward. Not singly responsible. There's others doing what he's doing as well. But wow, is he moving it forward. And this is a craftsman. So this is someone who was an apprentice at one point. So I think that's worth remembering for right there.
Yeah, I think he was probably most proud of his achievements from the silversmith to the proto-industrialist entrepreneur.
Yes, very entrepreneurial.
And his silver certainly merits looking at. There are some, pieces that he made that are remarkable. The Liberty Bowl, his fluted teapots later on are quite, other silversmiths buy them from him because they're so wonderful. So I think the silver certainly would be something that would at least get him in the decorative arts museums.
Because both of you researched Paul Revere, I'm guessing quite extensively to write your papers and books about him, is there any particular place, archive, museum, what have you, that you consider almost necessary if you want to have a more or fully complete understanding of Paul Revere? And if so, why that particular place? Is it because of its extensive collection? Is it because it has one specific thing that's very important to know about him? Just sort of what was the keystone of your research, I suppose?
Well, Massachusetts Historical Society is where you would start, because it's not just Revere's papers. When I studied Revere, I read the Adams papers, Henry Knox's papers, all of the people that were out in the Revolution from different angles talking about the time period and about Revere. The other thing is today is so much of the stuff is digitized. I actually do like going to repositories, but for government documents, one of the Boston Committee of Correspondence papers, a Provincial Congress, Committee of Safety records, all digitized.
Yes.
But I still like to wander through and flip through things. But just if you start with Mass Historical Society, you could be there for weeks going through all the different collections.
And indeed I was. Yeah,
Yes.
that was the same. The Mass Historical Society really, like you said, I like your answer so much, right? It has Revere, all of his surviving papers are there, loose correspondence, right? Letter books, which are great. He's drafting letters, right? In his letter book. Then he copies it onto a clean sheet of paper and mails it. But we have his draft, which sometimes the draft is more interesting when you see what gets crossed off, and replaced with a different word, or he's working on spelling, right? Even with working on spelling, he still is inconsistent with the spelling. Words like annealing, right? He knows what annealing is, but not how to spell it. So we're getting different things there. So in terms of the archives,
I was a research fellow there, so I was there for a really long time doing work. But most of the other stuff I did was digitized stuff like committees. Originally, it was actually documents. But when I've gone back, because periodically I've gone back, I've been re-examining everyone's celebrating all these turning points in the Revolution. I like the quiet periods in between because that's when they're organizing. So I started going back and rereading Committee of Correspondence papers, Provincial Congress papers, Committee of Safety. And you go back, you're looking at it from a different angle, you're asking a different question. So you can go through the same documents, but other stuff pops out at you because you're asking a different question.
That's great. But your question is a good one, right? Because so archive-wise, that would be my answer, right? It'd be mass historical, so many things there, not just about Paul Revere,
Yeah,
about
oh,
someone
yeah.
he might be working with or something and all that. But I remember being a graduate student doing this research, going every day to the Mass Historical Society, right? Just digging in. Eventually, they let me look at his book, right? I had to earn that. So at first, they're like, no, deal with the microfilm, you'll be fine, right? And eventually, when I was saying, I really can't read this, okay, put on the white gloves, let's go. We're going to go into the sealed vault, right? That was like a thrill. But I'm going to say, going to the Paul Revere House, right? That was my other fun, right? When I would go there, you had some great sources there too, right? Not as many though, right? But talking with everyone there, right? So it's not just about going to the archive. It was as if we were sitting around a coffee table and you expected Revere to walk in and join us, right? And oftentimes you would refer to him as Paul, right? Well, Paul was doing this at that time of his life, and oh, Paul, right? And I remember Pat Leahy, right? We would just have all these great conversations there. And so being with your own people and be able to bounce ideas around. So many times I would raise a hypothesis, right, when I visited the house to look at something and kind of get polite pushback a little bit. I'd say, Rob, maybe he's not that, but maybe try something different. That was phenomenal, right? So I just remember getting so much benefit out of that archive too.
So we've got a couple of questions from the live stream, and I'll start with one of them. So a commenter asked if you could speak to, and I think Nina might chime in on this one as well, your impression of Paul's response or how he felt in reaction to losing several of his children at a young age.
I'll go to that one because it is something that really touches me a lot. And, we are in the Revere House and people make a big deal about the number of children. Oh, all those children. And I always want to stop visitors and say, but wait a minute. This is a man who, at the death of one of his last children, not his last, but one of his close to his last children, and he is bereft at the loss of this dear little boy, he says. So it's a reminder that and he's a man who buries two wives, a number of his children, some of his grandchildren. And so he carries that sadness with him. And it is just tragic. And so I think, he's a guy, he's a dad, he's a husband, he's all those things. He's Colonel Revere, he's the Midnight Rider, but he's also that family man.
There's a woman, he has the third son named John.
Yep.
The first one dies, and he writes to somebody, I fear I shall never have another son again. Visitors would tend to think, well, he had all those kids, so just one dies, so who cares? And it's just, it doesn't matter what time period when, he's a father, he's a dad.
Yeah.
The loss of one child is too many.
Yeah.
And it does humanize him,
Totally. It's so easy to lose sight of that, saying, oh, he shifted from iron to working on bells at this time of his life. But then you look at what's going on, and he goes home, and this is what's happening in his household. And either there's a new child or he loses someone, and you're saying, like, it's all going together. It humanizes him completely.
Or his mother. His mother lived with him.
His mother being a presence for so long. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Just being there, a wife passing, who and then he gets remarried. Right. So just life is going on, and he's trying to hold it all together and continue supporting his family. But you could feel the weight there. Yeah, it's absolutely a vital, powerful part of the story, the big picture.
And the night of the midnight ride. And let's talk about Rachel. He goes out of the house. Rachel has a babe in arms. There's other children. And they don't know if they're going to see each other again. And so, Rachel is carrying the home, the hearth and home for all the times that Paul's away, whether he's away riding or doing business. And she is in some ways the unsung hero in his life and in supporting him. We don't know as much about his first wife, Sarah, but certainly Rachel is a character that needs more attention.
What always struck me about Rachel, she's only 11 years older than Revere's oldest daughter, Deborah. So she's got and then Paul Jr. So she's got teenage stepchildren, and then she has her own children. And she's in charge because he's gone.
That's right.
So in the spirit of spitballing around the coffee table at the Revere House, as you said, tell me, what do you guys think? What's Paul Revere if he were in our world today? He's got a software company. It's a B corporation. Like, where do you see him, like, if he was in this world?
I would say that was almost the question I would ask him, would be like, what do you think of AI, right? You know, I'd have a hard time not asking that question, right, and just doing that. But I was mentioning these different things that motivate him, right? You know, and I feel like his eyes would be saucers, right, as he looked at all the technology, and he would want to get involved in that, right? So probably, you know, he comes from metalworking, he might start there, but I could just imagine him seeing the role of technology, right, in advancing society and all the connections, and he's a roll up your sleeves and dig in kind of guy. So you could picture him asking enormous numbers of questions, finding the books, right, you know, suddenly saying, books, more books than I could dream possible, just digging in. But he has that entrepreneur side to him too. He would not just disappear in a library and never be seen again. He would be making a connection. Like, okay, what do we need? You know, what's the new product here? How can I go try and connect to it? That's the way I think he would try to operate. Our world is different now, right? It's not, you know, we have a lot more knowledge, a lot more education needed to catch up to the point where you're contributing. So it could be a challenge, but he has the drive. He's sharp. You know, I think he'd be just racing, right, to get in on one of these. You know, he's maybe a startup, right, if he could. If not, maybe just get hired as high as he could into a good company where he could start really pushing boundaries, right, and doing something wild.
I tend to be a contrarian, so I always like to look at the differences for to understand each time period on its own, the different cultural, social, and political values. So I find it difficult to figure out what an 18th century, 19th century person would think about this society today. I don't understand it, so I don't know how Paul Revere would, to be honest with you.
I see Paul sending one of his sons to sneak into SpaceX and figure out what they're not doing right and then make a better rocket.
I believe they call that industrial espionage.
It's exactly what it is.
Espionage, way to catch up fast. Yeah, okay.
Another question from the live stream. Where in Boston was Revere's workshop located? And can you provide a little kind of geographic context for that?
Clark's Wharf, the original silver shop.
Yes, right,
Okay.
yeah. So
Which is approximately, if you're walking up Hanover Street on Clark Street, of course the waterfront came closer, and then after the revolution was Cornhill, which would have been roughly Washington Street area, like sort of near the end of Washington Street near Old South Meeting House. That became more classy real estate. What's interesting about the 18th century compared to today the closer you live to the water, the more money you got. And the 18th century, when Revere moved inland from Clark's Wharf into North Square, that's societies of upward mobility. It's the exact opposite of today.
right.
Yeah, his shop moves around.
Yeah.
Right.
And he may have been, there's some sense that he was moving closer to his customer base, or maybe he was getting a better deal on rent
Right.
at a different location. So the shop was not in his backyard at 19 North Square.
North End, right, is what we're
Or
talking
his
about.
basement.
So, no, not
Yeah,
the
visitors
basement.
always thought his shop was in the house.
Yeah.
And then the big move is when he eventually relocates to Canton, right? At first he has 2 locations, and then he just completely moves into Canton, largely because there's more space there and there's water power, right, to drive the rolling mills that he needs there. So he buys some property out in Canton on the river, right, you know, and he has a property that had water wheels in the water, so he can get up to speed pretty quickly on that one.
I don't know if I should ask a question that you can debunk a thought I have about Revere and his engraving, or if I should ask a question about his relationship with Joseph Warren. So if you want a debunking one, I've got that. Or
We go
alternatively,
with the debunking one?
Yeah, what do you
Yeah,
think? Are we in the mood to
yeah.
debunk? Right,
Go with the
okay.
yeah.
I'm sick of talking about Revere and Dr. Warren. I've done several lectures recently.
okay. So this could be a misapprehension on my part, but my understanding was that someone did a depiction of the Boston Massacre and gave it to Paul Revere to engrave. But my understanding is that he sort of took that other artist, that other work, and created his own plate, the one that we largely know today of the massacre. And
The Pelham engraving.
from that, he earned enough money to buy his home.
Well, I don't know if it directly up to buying his home. There's no international copyright law till I think was 1891. So it's fairly standard practice for engravers. A lot of Revere's engravings are copied from British magazines, and he just changes certain things for an American audience. So Pelham did the engraving first, Henry Pelham, who's a half-brother of John Singleton Copley. And Revere sees a copy of it, and he adapts it. And he gets it to market and he makes money. And then there's a letter, and it's not clear whether Pelham actually sent the letter to Revere. He accuses him of, you robbed me as though you robbed me on the highway, blah, blah, blah. And in the Clarence Brigham's The Standard Book on Revere's Engravings, he writes he's not sure that Pelham actually sent the letter to Revere, that it may have been a draft. So you could say, on the one hand, by our standards, say Revere basically stole his work. On the other hand, there is no copyright law, and that's standard practice. So with Revere, there's always, you have to look at things in two different ways. Is he just saying, I'm trying to do something to get people fired up and see what happens when we have soldiers in our town, in a peaceful British town, you see what happens, people are slaughtered on the streets. Is that in his mind the patriotic motive, or is it also a little bit of his ambition? And I think it's probably a little bit of both. But we can't, again, we can't judge them by our standards, because this is standard practice for engravers to copy other people's work. It's a piece of propaganda. I mean, the soldiers are standing in front of, it's supposed to be the custom house, and the sign that says Butcher's Hall. Get it? They're butchers. Okay. So, and it's an amazingly, imagine if you lived in Virginia and you open your paper and there's Boston News and you find about the bloody massacre in King Street. 5 people were killed. Now, that's a tragedy for 5 people and their families, but the word massacre is a loaded term. And you see Revere's engraving, the streets run red with blood. This is propaganda, and it was very effective. Artistically, that's a personal thing. I would say look at both Pelham's engraving, Revere's, and make up your own mind which one you think is better.
And I'll just jump in very briefly. I don't know off the top of my head how much money he made from the engraving, but he had already purchased the house several weeks before the massacre. Yeah. So whether he put some of the earnings towards paying off his mortgage is a question, but it would not chronologically be that, all right, now I can make it, now I can buy a house. But that's a fun myth. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you had a specific example of an advantage that Revere had, either politically or like business-wise, because he was a Freemason.
Well, I can answer it. This doesn't have to do with being a Mason, but when Revere, he inherits both his trade and a good shop from his father. So in some ways, he's leveraged into his abilities as a silversmith because of his father training him. And he says his father left him a good customer base and that opportunity. So in a way, he inherits that. He carries it with his own skill, but he's got that piece of advantage that his father didn't have. His father had to build a shop and a customer base. That's not Masonic related, but
it's kind of interesting, the letter that Revere writes to his French cousin Matthias, they're discussing the family genealogy. Revere's father died when he was only 54, Revere was 19. And Revere can't legally open his own shop until he's 21, but he writes to his cousin that my father left no estate, but he left a good name and 7 children. He did leave an estate. He left a fully stocked silver shop. I found an assessment of Revere's tools. They were worth, at one point, it was over 200 pounds sterling. If Revere's father had not left him that, Revere may never have opened his own shop. He may have been working for somebody for the rest of his life. So his father, and he left him a customer base as well. His father wasn't a Mason as far as I know, so that's a whole separate other thing. But his father left him a good trade and tools, and his early customers largely were from his father. Mm-hmm. And then he developed his own base, his fellow Masons, his neighbors, his friends, fellow Sons of Liberty. He has multiple connections to people. There is Lodge Brothers, there is his friends, they're members of the North End Caucus, which planned the Tea Party and other events. So everything he does just deepens his connection to his fellow master artisans.
Yeah, that's the best way I would be able to try and answer this question, right, is Revere was throughout his life, he was a member of many organizations. Yeah. And someone did a study of this, and I think the percentage was something like, he had a way of converting something like 20% of the people in each of the organizations, his church, Masons, right? The Sons of Liberty when he joined that, whatever organization we're talking about, around 20% of each one also became his customers. So it's interesting. So he's such a good networker, right? That he's like, so you can imagine him in church. He's not sitting there marketing his wares or anything, but he's like chatting with people afterwards. He's a friendly guy. And at some point it's like, Mr. Revere, I was in the market for a new teapot. Let's have that conversation, right? And sometimes it works out. So the Masons were a good group, right, for him to be practicing that. I think that was absolutely an advantage that way. In terms of like a specific, like, oh, this Mason was this person who opened this door for him, I'm not aware of that. That might be impossible to prove even, right? I'm not sure.
Well, he made stuff for Masonic lodges, but also for individual. He made Masonic jewels, but they also bought non-Masonic stuff like teapots and dinnerware.
He also sold to the lodge. That's a great point, actually. Right? The lodge itself would be his customer, right, for certain things too.
And they trusted him to make things like ceremonial jewels and certificates because he understood the symbolism of those things. Certainly, a lot of the people who are the leaders in the sort of patriotic movement, Dr. Joseph Warren and others, are Masons as well. So you have a social structure and a structure that's built on a lot of people being Masons at the time. So it's a little hard to unpack the advantage versus the fact that these are just his friends and colleagues.
So it seems like every description of Revere ends up saying he's a middle-class artisan, he's not a founding father, he was just an everyday guy. But we keep talking about him. We can't stop talking about him. I mean, we write books about him. We preserve his house. We put his face on cookware and buses and stamps. If Revere was here today, I mean, we keep saying it, if he walked through the door, what would he think about his legacy?
He'd love it. He wrote 3 accounts of the Midnight Ride. The first one, the deposition, probably written within a few days of the ride. The second deposition is just he corrects some grammar and punctuation. Third account is a longer letter to Jeremy Belknap of the Mass Historical Society. It's published 1798. We don't know the exact date. But he has an opening paragraph. He says, I'm providing you some facts and anecdotes about events prior to the Revolution, which I do not recall to have read in any history book. I have a unique perspective. So I think he would love it. I'm from Revere, Massachusetts, named for Paul Revere. There's Revere, Mass, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Missouri. I think he would have delighted in the impact of Longfellow's poem, have towns named after him. He had a strong, healthy ego. So I think he would be delighted that we're still talking about it. And he'd probably be saying, no, you got that wrong. You got that wrong. Yep. He liked it. He liked the attention. He liked leaving his mark, I think, on the world. When Belknap actually published the letter the first time, he omitted the first paragraph and brags about his unique perspective, and he just jumps right into Revere's account of the Midnight Ride. When it was reprinted, I think 1876, they put that back in, and that really tells us more about Paul Revere.
I could not agree more. I think he would be thrilled, right? I think that, right, if you look at the things he valued in his life, right, and I say we could even use a symbol, right? When a silversmith would make their piece of silver, they would stamp their maker's mark onto it. Sometimes silversmiths would subcontract to each other. So someone might say, look, could you make the handles? I'll buy them from you and put them on the teapot that I'm making. The person making the handle would try and sneak a maker's mark onto the handle. Revere would just smash over that with his, right? It's like, no. This is the Revere maker's mark here. This is my silver. I don't care if you made the handle. The only maker's mark we see is mine. And that was actually, it was both like feeling like, oh, I have a reputation to uphold, and he wants to get more business, right? Someone might say, oh, this is a beautiful teapot. Oh, Revere made it. Great. I'll go buy from him next time. So knowing that we're still talking about him, right there, he's happy. I think right there, full stop, he's thrilled, right? The fact that we are talking about him for his patriotic service, the Midnight Ride is still being celebrated, big boost upwards, right? He's very happy about that. The fact there are still family members, direct descendants named Revere, right? He loves his family, right? He's always talking about them. Thrilled, right? He'd be very happy about that. There's still a Revere Copper Products, right? Headquartered in Rome, New York, right? I think he'd be delighted about that.
I cook on Revere ware all the time.
Revere
They
ware.
were my mom's
right,
from the 50s.
Just like that. That's right. That was a
them.
division sold off from his company. It went through different things there. We mentioned Revere ware. I mentioned Revere Copper Products, right? His work lives on in that way. So I think that he would be just absolutely delighted. But like you said, he'd be sitting at this table, taking the microphone off of me, right, and explaining like his side of like, well, here's what you got wrong, Rob. You messed up this part, right? So yeah, he'd be right in it.
And I agree. And I imagine him standing in front of the statue and saying, I love it. Taller, thinner, younger. How we all want to be remembered.
Well, thank you all so much.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you so much.